God doesn't talk very much. God never stops speaking. God is speaking the whole time, but doesn't seem to talk very often. That is, doesn't all that frequently seem to use human words to human beings. Happily, we have the Bible. That's a really helpful set of human words. And right now, we're looking at a letter in the New Testament part of the Bible known as the letter to the Hebrews, or as we're calling it, Hebrews. And it's called that because the way the letter is written reveals that it was sent to people to be read aloud in churches or whatever, but people who really knew the Hebrew background to their Christian faith, who really related to the scriptures of the Old Testament and to their Jewish past. They possibly weren't all Jews, but they must have been very familiar with the Jewish scriptures and the Jewish faith. So, the letter to the Hebrews. And the writer begins with this thought: God's been speaking a lot. He's just not been talking that often. It says, well, God has spoken in many and various ways through the prophets, to our ancestors in the past. In other words, we inherit this vast amount of writing and stuff because God has spoken a whole heap of stuff, and God's always speaking in lots of ways. But recently, what the writer calls these last days, God's spoken in a totally different way. It says, God has spoken to us through his Son. And then he goes on to talk about the nature of the Son through whom he's spoken. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. So I'm reading from chapter 1, verse 1. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. Goes on to talk about the cross, the resurrection and ascension, and so on. Anyway, we're just going to hang out for a little bit in the first bit. God has been speaking always. God speaks in every single corner of the universe. God speaks in every element of nature. God's Spirit speaks to our spirit and our hearts, our minds, and our inner being. So we have a blend of God speaking to us through what we see and experience, what we investigate, find out, experiment, and determine in the ways of nature, and speaking to us in how that nature lands in our minds, our hearts, and our thoughts. And also speaking to us in much more direct ways. We might call it supernaturally, just the work of God's Spirit speaking to us in a number of vast range of ways. But it's never to be limited simply to human language. Even when there's human language involved, as you find when you read the scripture, the horizons open up. It's never just very simple, very straightforward. It's always rich, deep, expansive, wonderful, profound, and far-reaching in scope. So God is forever speaking. He just doesn't talk very much. Anyway, welcome to this video presentation of our message for Sunday the 20th of June. It's a special day in one of our two churches where some of our folk are being baptised to make their witness, their stand, their line in the sand, as one of them put it, to make their mark, to say who it is that they have determined to put their faith and trust in. It's God through Jesus Christ, through the working of God's Spirit. And I'm really looking forward to sharing that moment with them. by the time you're watching this, it may already have passed. I'll be very happy with it. So, what is this thing that the writer to the Hebrews is getting at in the first few verses? It's this, that whereas God can speak in any way and all ways, God has the entire universe through which to speak. God has beyond the universe through which to speak. God is speaking in billions of ways everywhere per moment. To everyone, to everything, God is always speaking. But the writer to the Hebrews says, however, diverse and ancient and rich as the speaking of God has been for us, now God has spoken to us in an altogether special sense. God has spoken to us through his Son. Now, if you want to introduce yourself to people, the very best way is to show up in person. You can write a letter, send an email, send a text, make a video. There's lots of things you can do to introduce who you are to somebody. But the very best way to do it is to show up in person. And so God has spoken completely plainly. Sometimes people say to me, well, why doesn't God just tell it to us in black and white, simple? And I think, but that's exactly what God has done in Jesus. Nothing can be plainer and more straightforward than to show up in person to speak to human beings as a human being, to live out your life in front of the camera, as it were, so that people can see it and write it down and record it for future generations, to speak your teaching in human words to people as yourself, doing it your way, being you. What could be more straightforward than that? There is absolutely nothing complex about it. The best way to speak is to show up in person, and then you've said most of it. And that's exactly what we have in Jesus. Remember how he spoke to his disciples and said, if you have seen me, if you spent 3 years with me, well, you've been watching the Father. You've been watching God all the time. You just haven't recognized it yet. You see, the issue never was that God wanted to prove God's existence, which would be a bit strange and a rather crazy thing for God to want to do. God's not at all interested in that. God knows that God's existence is completely plain, is in full sight. God's purpose in Jesus has been different to that. God's purpose in Jesus is to say, hello, this is who I am. I love you. I've come to help you, to connect with you. Shall we or shall we not reconnect in the way that I intended in the beginning? It couldn't be easier. There is nothing more straightforward. And the beauty of turning up in person as another human being is, you don't have to be clever to get this. You can hear Jesus, whether you're a clever person who knows how to investigate nature and carry out experiments, observations, calculations, and whatever else, or whether you're not a clever person, or whether perhaps you have a learning disability or something that really gets in the way of some of that stuff. No matter who you are, if God turns up in person, then God is introducing God's self to us. And that, says the writer to the Hebrews, exactly what we have in the Son. This is the one through whom God made the universe, who is the exact likeness of God. I know you've had it, but let's read those bits again. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times in various ways. But in these last days, God has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. Let's just pause on that bit a minute. We're not going to have time to look at every aspect, but that's a really important bit. So to Hebrew people, remember this is the letter to the Hebrews, so people who, if they weren't themselves Jews, and I suspect probably most of them were certainly steeped in the Jewish scriptures and the Jewish faith in some sense. They had a working knowledge of it. You can tell that by the way the writer writes to them. It's why the letter's called to the Hebrews. And the writer is eager to convey something to people who are very familiar with a principle. The principle is this. It may seem strange to you, it does to me, but it wasn't at all strange to them. It was the way their communities and society thought and worked. A son for them was an extension of the father of that son. That the father-son relationship was, in a sense, the primary relationship in society. Through their sons, fathers extended themselves into the present and into the future. The son was expected to carry the very identity, the heart, mindset, value system, responsibility for all family well-being, duties in society, enemies, friends, whatever, land. The son simply took on what was the father's. The son was an extension of the father's own being, but in another person. I don't think I've overstated it. If I have, it's not by much. So when you understand that about the background, you see what's being said. What's being said is the Son is really the Son of God. Jesus actually is the likeness of God in human nature. Jesus actually is the true representation of God. The writer then goes to unpack this in two ways. First, with reference to heavenly being, and then with reference to human being. So the writer says, do you know what? There could be however many angels, but to none of them does God speak as to the Son. That none of them have that relationship with Father God that the Son has. They're angels. We may be very impressed by them. They may be very beyond human imagination, outside of our dimensions. They may be many things. I don't quite know what they were thinking about when they spoke about angels, but certainly not what was on our Christmas cards for the most part. But the point is, angels are heavenly beings. They belong with God in eternity. And the writer is saying, Jesus is greater than the greatest of them and the sum of them all put together. And then he switches to human nature and life in time and space and planet Earth as human beings. And for Hebrew people, the greatest person that had ever lived, most would have agreed instantly, was Moses. Moses was, there'd been many great prophets, but Moses was the greatest prophet. There'd been many great leaders for the Hebrew people, but Moses was the greatest leader. Moses did all kinds of stuff. Moses saved the people. Moses even offered to become a stranger to God if it would help save the people and keep and sacrifice his relationship with God to grant them their relationship with God when they made themselves pretty difficult to handle. And that the parallels between Moses and Jesus are obvious and many. I think the writer to the Hebrews, just as he was a little bit concerned that people might think, as some indeed said, that Jesus was an angel come to earth and miss the point of who Jesus really is. The other thing is they might not recognize that Jesus wasn't somebody kind of after the likeness of Moses, but in fact Moses was the first glimmering of what would happen in Jesus, in great leadership, in great conveying of God's truth to people, in living out a life of faithfulness. So it goes on in chapter 3. So read that for yourself. I read a little bit of chapter 1 last night. I'll leave you to read chapter 3. How he makes this comparison. He says, well, if you imagine a rich man's household, Well, you've got the senior servant, and Moses is like the senior servant. But then you've got the son. The senior servant's never going to own the home. Senior servant's never going to be the big boss. But the son is going to own the home. And the son is going to inherit the status of the father. And so, in a sense, is already that extension of the father. The message, I think, is this. Don't underestimate who Jesus is. He's not just some great religious figure from the past. Jesus is nothing less than the Son of God in human being. God as human. God speaking as plainly as it's possible to speak to people by showing up as a human being. Say, watch me, and you're looking at God. Listen to me, and you're listening to God. Follow me, and you're following God. And I'll take you all the way home. Anyway, people, God bless you this week, and I pray you'll get to see more and more of who Jesus is and what it means to make him Lord of your life and to follow him, trust him, let him be for you all that God gave him to us to be. Letter to the Hebrews, so rich, and that's just a little bit at the very beginning that we've touched on. You have a good week, stay safe, and God bless.